Morning, everybody. Happy biggest strike in NHS history day, till the next one anyway. And welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by Britain's longest serving political reporter, Nigel Nelson, who writes both the Sunday Mirror and the Sunday People. Good morning, Nigel.
Good morning, Susie.
Now, this is the People's Paper Review, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. Those of you listening later on podcast are just going to have to try not to hurt yourselves for the next 24 hours. Well, actually, the next 12 hours, take it back. So after that, let it all hang out. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on new images of missing mum Nicola Bulley as she set out on a dog walk from which she never returned. It's all part of police efforts to sort of spark a memory from someone who may have seen her or be able to offer some clue to her disappearance, which is still unexplained. But inside the paper are 2 pages on what is an historic first today. Members of the Royal College of Nursing across 73 hospital trusts are walking out for 12 hours starting at 7:30 this morning, along with more than 10,000 ambulance staff in the GMB and Unite unions who for the first time are walking out on the same day. Now, they've been asking for a pay rise, taking into account inflation, along with some other issues about working practices and so on. But inflation's now at 10%. Now, today, Nigel, there's been a government minister on the airwaves. They've been out over the weekend as well, talking about how they can't pay any more. They'd love to, but they can't. And yet in Wales, the government went into negotiations, did a deal amounting to about 3%, and there's no strike and everyone's back at work. So is our government going to do that, Nigel? A, when the waiting lists are stretching long past the next general election, or B, when they've let the bodies pile high and decided that that's not really a good look?
Well, I think that the government's plan is to try and tough it out. The issue really is that the government will talk to the unions, but they won't talk about pay, which is obviously what this is all about, which is ridiculous. As you pointed out, in Wales, there is a pay offer. So as a result of that, the strike gets called off. And that's the kind of thing that should be happening in Whitehall. And they're just not doing it. Now, when it comes to the nurses, that they were demanding 19%. While that figure is reasonable because they've lost 20% in wages basically since the Tories got in, it's still not really very realistic. And I think that the Royal College of Nursing has indicated they will settle for much lower. So as a result of that, there is scope for some talks, but the government just won't do it. Now, the question is who's responsible. It seems like the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, would like to actually get talks going. And he's been prevented from doing so by Rishi Sunak and his Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt.
Well, you say that, Nigel, but I can recall when this government took over, which was about 5 minutes ago. Steve Barclay reportedly went into a meeting with Jeremy Hunt and said, I don't need any extra money for the NHS. They'll be absolutely fine. And Jeremy Hunt was supposed to be taken quite aback by it. Now, when that report came out, I think Steve Barclay was furious and saying that's definitely not what happened. But is he now saying that he wants to do it and he's having his hands tied? And is that really true? And if so, would he expect that money to come out of the existing NHS budget? Because
that's a key question, isn't it? Whether or not it would actually have to come out of existing money. Now, I mean, where I'm getting this from is not from the government side. I'm getting this from the union side. What they're saying is that the indications that they've got from ministers, and this applies also to transport as well, to the RMT dispute. What they're hearing is that the ministers in charge actually do want to try and get some talks going. And it is the two men at the top who are actually preventing this. Now, the other point that the unions would make is that if you look at all the various strikes going on, they're all in the public sector. And what the unions are saying is that they've had constructive talks in the private sector, have been able to get a load of settlements through, and that's why the private sector is exempt from the industrial action that's going on at the moment. So it all kind of adds up to the fact that it is Jeremy Hunt and it is Rishi Sunak who are simply saying no.
They're just saying no. What do you think, everybody? Is that the way the government should be handling it? Should they be coming to the table and trying to negotiate? Wales has proved you can do it at 3% if you get out there and start talking. Bring that 19% claim, which I think is already down to 15 anyway, because they wanted 5% over inflation, and inflation has dropped. Then there are ways through it, but are they right to hold steady and say no, we're gonna play it tough? Jerry says something is not quite right. Why no negotiations with anyone? Could it be the government treasury has been emptied out over the past 13 years and the British taxpayers' money is now safely stored away in offshore tax havens? Jerry, that will be theft from the state. I don't think the government has actually quite done that. But I do possibly think you've got a point in some respects, perhaps, hasn't he, Nigel? Because the amount of taxpayers' money that was paid out during the pandemic to mates of mates that then went into perhaps businesses and for dodgy PPE and things that went into perhaps different tax jurisdictions. Yeah, perhaps some of it has gone that route. He's not entirely wrong, is he?
No, I mean the government lost a lot of money on the whole on all the various COVID preparations we were making, especially on PPE. A lot of it would turn out to be completely useless. And Jerry's probably right. Some of that money did filter its way through into tax havens. I don't think, though, with respect to Jerry, that's quite the issue. What COVID did show us is that there is plenty of money to spare when they actually need it. So the kind of money that Rishi Sunak was splashing out when he was Chancellor is £400 billion. He was coming up with financial proposals that someone like John McDonnell might have done had he ever got into power. So quite clearly the money is there. It is a question of whether or not the government want to spend it. But the only way you're going to come to any kind of compromise here is to actually sit down and try and talk about it. And this is the bizarre situation we found ourselves in. That is exactly what they won't do.
It is strange, isn't it? It's like saying going into a custody negotiation with your ex-partner and saying, well, I'll talk about the divorce, but I'm not going to talk about custody. But it's a custody negotiation. Well, I'm just not going to talk about the children, but let's talk about the issues in our marriage. That's different. That's an entirely different thing. Leslie says, isn't it time we all went out on strike? After all, we have and are already paying for our NHS. I don't know how you go and strike if you're not in the NHS. We can all just go out and join the picket lines, I suppose. But there is a point, essentially, she's got there, which is that everyone kind of is affected by this. And there's one really good example in the paper. So there's a spread inside, which is using the best example of what the NHS does for us. And that's the story of Max Johnson, who spent years waiting for a heart transplant and whose story helped to change the organ donation laws, thanks to a Mirror campaign. Now, his family was supported by nurses they say went above and beyond throughout. They drove miles to get him a McDonald's at the end of a long shift. They took him out on their days off because it's a vocation and not done for the pay. But there's one comment in here that really struck me, Nigel. His dad, Paul, said, if your child needs a heart transplant, you can forget Bupa. You will need the NHS to save them. That's the point, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to things like that, that's what the NHS is there for. And yes, he wouldn't be able to get his heart transplant privately, so this has to be done through the NHS. And I mean, it's a good example of how wonderful the people are who work in it, and they're battling a system which is actually falling apart. So what is going to happen when we finally get to the end of this particular round of industrial chaos is we're going to have to seriously think about how the NHS as a system needs reforming. It's not the people who need reform, it's the actual system itself, which is just not working. Now, in Max's case, it did. I mean, that's absolutely great. But we are facing a situation where the NHS could actually collapse. And successive governments have turned a blind eye to this over the years. Now we're at crisis point. They're actually going to start, they're going to have to start doing something. And we are going to have to think really seriously about how the NHS will look going forward.
Well, part of the problem, though, isn't it? Surely, I mean, the NHS is set up on like a gatekeeper model. So the GPs that you're supposed to go to first will filter your cases. They will deal with you if they can. They will manage your pain in the community and that kind of stuff. And anything that they can't deal with and needs a specialist, they filter that through to the hospitals, who then have less work to do, fewer patients to see than the GPs, but can do it in more in depth and more thoroughly. And that's kind of collapsed fundamentally because there aren't enough GPs to manage the gates. There aren't enough, there's not enough funding there. There's not enough people there to actually operate the filtering system properly. So people are just ending up in A&E with a crisis. And then the hospitals are suddenly having to deal with more crises than they normally would because it isn't being done at the other end. So does it actually need reform, or does it just need doing properly in the first place?
No, I think probably it actually will need proper reform. So take the example of GPs. You're absolutely right. If the system is working properly, you go to your GP. If you need to be referred on, that's how you do it. That bypasses any need to suddenly go into A&E. The problem with the GP end is that an awful lot of them are business partners rather than doctors. So they're effectively running a small and in some cases quite large business. That means the GPs themselves are swamped by paperwork. Now, if you had a different system, so instead of trying to run a business, you make GPs salaried NHS staff, which is what happens to hospital consultants. A lot of the GPs would now favour this kind of route. So those are the kind of reforms that could make things better and mean you could get a GP appointment without having to wait a month for it.
Yeah, that might make a difference. Marion says the NHS needs to stop using agency staff. Some trusts have been offering up to £1,000 for someone to come in and do a shift from agencies because they're so desperate to cover the strikes. But of course, that's often the same nurses. So that doesn't really make any sense. Mark says getting inflation down is more important for everyone at the moment. So everyone has to have a pay freeze. It's as simple as that. Mark, one point I'd like to make to you there, actually two. The first one is that according to the Office of National Statistics, the average private sector pay rise last year was 7.2%. The average public sector pay rise was 3.3%. That's why they're on strike. There is a big difference, and no one else is getting quite the pay freezes that the nurses and the public sector are. Secondly, if you got inflation down to zero tomorrow, suddenly zero inflation, right? If something that you spent £100 on last year is now £120, let's say, or £110 today, you get inflation down to 0% tomorrow, it still costs £110. It just stops increasing in price. That's all that happens when you get inflation down. Unless you have deflation, which is usually a sign of terrible economic chaos, unless prices actually start sinking and crunching again, it's always going to cost more, and it's always going to be the current prices that we have embedded forever. The price of a pint of milk now is the price of a pint of milk, and there is no way that you've still got to find a way to make your existing pay stretch to cover that. So getting inflation down, although that's something the government likes to talk about, and it is important, it just means prices are rising more slowly, but you still are just as broke, I'm afraid. Now, we need to move on a little bit. Keep asking us your questions. What do you think about the state of the NHS and how the government can handle it? Now, Max's dad, who was talking there, of course, isn't the health secretary. And we seem to have a government that is run by people who either don't use the NHS that much themselves or don't need to rely on it or aren't particularly ill. It's certainly quite obvious to someone like me that the percentage of disabled people in the cabinet is 0, as far as I can tell, whereas the general population, it's about 10-15%. So perhaps they can't see the point of doing more to protect something that looks after all of us. But they can see the point, usually, Nigel, of protecting their seats in Parliament. And I would have thought they've got those because of the votes of millions of people who do rely on the NHS. At some point, the maths will kick in and they'll go, we have to do this because the voters want us to and they need us to. Or have they all completely given up and ever winning an election again anyway?
No, I don't think anybody, any MP actually wants to lose their job. Well, a few might. I mean, they got fed up with it, but for the majority, no. I mean, it is likely that the next government will be a Labour one, but it's not by no means a certainty. And there's still a huge sort of electoral mountain to climb for Keir Starmer anyway, after being 80 seats behind after the last election. But you're absolutely right. I think that the government are beginning to realise that the NHS really is one of the top issues, and I think that it goes along there with number one is cost of living and the economy. That's what people most care about. The NHS is probably coming in at number 2, and of course that a lot of activity around cross-channel migrants, because people say that one of their priorities is curbing immigration. But yes, the NHS will be a major factor when it comes to the next general election. And Labour are already using words that I've never heard politicians use before. So Wes Streeting talks about the NHS must reform or die. He says that we should treat it as a service, not a shrine. I think that's absolutely right. And that's why I think the reform of it is going to be the key issue.
Well, it's got about having a big idea, of course, and Labour can't really talk too much about their big ideas yet because all the committees that decide their manifesto haven't really reported back and aren't saying things publicly. And if they do it too soon before a general election, they'll find that the Tories have nicked it. So they don't want to give their big ideas out too early. Now, Stuart says, just to inform everyone, the government has no interest in saving the NHS. Why do you think they've made the trade deal with America? So our NHS would break down to private doctors and nurses. I don't think there has been a private trade deal yet with America. I think that's still in abeyance, isn't it, Nigel?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. At the moment, that's being held up mostly because of the aftermath of Brexit. And we still haven't sorted out Northern Ireland, which is an issue close to America's heart. So that's the reason for that. When it comes down to whether or not that a trade deal, if it happens, would end up with the privatisation of the NHS, I'm not sure it would. The NHS has certainly been exempt from any kind of area where a trade deal comes. I think you have to worry a bit more about sort of chlorinated chickens and things like that.
Yes, beef that's not been raised in the best of ways. Leslie says, if they reform the system, can we expect the private sector that's draining NHS funding to be reduced? Labour seems to think that private sector does have a role to play, Leslie, although I agree with you. What happens in the private sector does with NHS work is it gets pay for stuff and it cuts corners to increase its profits. It doesn't necessarily produce the outcome that everyone would like it to. One last question on this, Nigel, before we move on. Under what circumstances would the government come to the table, do you think, bearing in mind there's a general election in about 300 days?
Well, I mean, I think that they come to the table when they've got no alternative. As I said at the beginning, that the idea at the moment is to tough it out. It's a bit like something out of the Margaret Thatcher playbook with the miners. You just hold in there and hope eventually that it's the unions that will give in. I see no sign of that. And so if these strikes continue, I think eventually the government's going to have to accept they are going to have to increase pay.
Yeah, they're going to have to go. I think everyone seems to know that they're going to have to do it. It's just a case of how you get Rishi and Jeremy Hunt to the point of realising it and being able to say it with a straight face. We can look forward to that perhaps, I don't know, maybe 3 months before a general election. I think they'll suddenly find the money then. It's amazing, isn't it? Now, keep asking your questions, everybody. Get into the comments. We're going to move on now to terribly sad news, I'm afraid. Liz Truss has been reanimated. That's right, the most disastrous Prime Minister in British history, who managed to cost this country more than £1 billion a day in her very short 44-day reign, has written a 4,000-word essay, because she's got time to kill now, in one of yesterday's unpopular papers, in which she blamed it on the left-wing political establishment. She says it would all have worked, but she just wasn't given a chance. This morning, some of those die-hard lefties who blocked her, like George Osborne, have been quoted telling her to put a sock in it. Nigel, this seems to be part of a campaign to sort of reinstate her political credibility, her reputation, perhaps apparently sort of try to shape the Tory party in the years to come, sow the seeds for what will come after the next election. Does she have any support at all, or is this just a one-woman delusional nightmare that we're all stuck in?
Well, the mystery at the moment is actually what she's after. You're absolutely right. She's trying to rehabilitate herself. You're going to see an awful lot more of Liz Truss in the coming days and weeks. She's planning all sorts of media appearances. I think she actually wants to try and rescue her shredded reputation. Is probably the main reason for this. It's a very odd way of doing it. That the idea to accuse the market speculators, currency speculators, of being some kind of left-wing cabal of economists is really quite peculiar. Now, I've sat through, I don't know, about sort of 50-odd budgets and financial statements in my time. And when I heard this one, I was sort of sitting in the House of Commons press gallery, looking down at the Chancellor's head. And I really couldn't believe what I was hearing. That budget was totally and utterly bonkers. And when he got to the bit about, oh, well, let's scrap the top 45% rate of tax, you kind of thought, what is he doing? Why? What's the reason for that? There was no great clamour for it. It just seemed to be something he threw in. And the reason the markets reacted the way they did is because they hadn't costed any of the plans they were doing. So they were about to spend £45 billion without any kind of costing at all. That's what threw the markets into panic. I mean, these people are there not for politics, they're there for profits. And if they see their profits going down, that's the reason they reacted the way they did. So it was the budget what did it, if you like.
Yeah, I suspect that she saw, Rishi Sunak getting away, I suppose, with spending 400 billion, and thought, well, how can they get upset about my 40-odd billion? It's so much less. Why are they upset at me and not at him? But that was a pandemic. And although things were done in a rush in both instances, the markets wanted the economy supported in that way during the pandemic, and they didn't want what Truss and Kwarteng were doing. So which is why they reacted so badly. Now, Mike says, Mike, this is evil and twisted, I'm afraid. I, for one, would welcome Liz Truss as leader of a Conservative opposition, preferably sooner rather than later. I think, actually, Mike, although I can see your point, it is always, always bad for a sitting government when the opposition is weak, because it means that government starts to become, as we saw when Ed Miliband was leading Labour, for example, when Cameron was in charge, you see a government that decides it can do things without checking the homework first, right? They don't need to worry about it because the other guys have got nothing. And they don't get scrutinised properly. They don't get hauled over the coals. Their homework isn't checked, and they start to feel entitled and that they ought to be there and they have to be there and there is no alternative. And whether the sitting government is Labour or Tory, that is bad news for the country, I would suggest. From your perspective, Nigel, of being in this job for a very long time, what do you think? Should Liz Truss be leader of the opposition?
I mean, what you do need is you've got to have a good, strong opposition. Also, I'd throw in there that the House of Lords does quite a lot of scrutiny because they've got a lot of experts their end, which is quite handy. And also the select committee system in the House of Commons. They do a pretty good job of scrutinising the departments they're looking at. But yes, when it comes down to what goes on in the chamber, you need an opposition that really works. Now, I think Keir Starmer is actually pretty effective about this. He certainly, because he is an advocate, or certainly was before, he can sort of forensically dissect what the government is getting wrong, which is good stuff. I'd like to hear some more ideas from Labour about how they would repair it, because that's the way they're going to win the next election.
Yeah, I was speaking to a new peer a little while ago who said he found it absolutely terrifying to be in the House of Lords, because you walk in there and you start to hear them speak and see the debates, and you realise how terrifyingly good and expert these people are. And what he didn't say, but the obvious implication, is that when you're in the House of Commons, you're quite used to being surrounded by egotistical idiots. And you don't have to do too much homework at all. So I suspect that may be a part of government's problem, and certainly part of Liz Truss's problem, perhaps. We shall wait and see, won't we? I'm trying to move my head in such a way I don't get a band of light on. Right, thank you very much, Nigel, for all that. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. We have some good news, though, in the world. There definitely is some, and this is very good news this morning. Here it is. Now, we all know that the royal family are very badly behaved. They have sex in fields behind pubs. They question the skin colour of unborn babies. They are pretty rude to prime ministers, foreigners, and victims of international sex trafficking. But no more. For when comedian Frank Skinner pointed out in his radio show that he was a bit taken aback when the Countess of Wessex ribbed him about the quality of his singing at the Royal Variety performance, she sat down and hand-wrote a personal apology letter saying sorry for mocking him and hurting his feelings. Now, Nigel, you might not realise this, but Sophie hails from a village just near mine here in Kent, so she's obviously just as classy as I am, of the entirely different class of boyfriend. Is this proof, do you think, that the royals can show some class so long as it's injected by a commoner?
I think it shows that Sophie Wessex has got some class. I mean, this is exactly what you should do. This was at the Royal Variety performance at the Albert Hall. And obviously what Sophie was trying to do was crack a joke. And she was saying to Frank Skinner, don't give up on the day job. The joke fell flat. Frank was obviously a bit hurt by it. And what you should do is, when these things happen, you write a personal letter of apology, which is exactly what she did. Frank accepted it, which is exactly what he should have done. Both sides are then happy. Both sides have behaved graciously. And yes, I think that Sophie Wessex is a great example to the rest of the royal family.
Yeah, and perhaps to other people in public life as well. If Dominic Raab, completely innocent, of course, of all bullying allegations, had, when any of these allegations maybe were raised with him in person, sat down and written a letter and said, I'm sorry about that, I didn't intend to, whoops-a-daisy, we wouldn't be where we are now with the Deputy Prime Minister under investigation by a QC. That's what a little bit of common sense and commoner Kentish nous will do for just about anybody. And I am open for employment by anybody who wishes to employ my services as a consultant. I can tell them that at length in the royal family or anywhere else. Thank you, Nigel, for taking us through all that. I'm glad to see that a maid of Kent is doing the right thing, and even though she's married into that blasted family. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. Thank you to Liz Truss for still giving us something to talk about and worry about, but please go away now. And good luck, everybody who's on a picket line today. Let's hope the government comes around and actually starts negotiating at some point soon for all our sakes. We'll see you all again on Wednesday for another edition of the News Agenda. But until then, tatty bye.